webinar covers the first part of the lecture that deals with the secretory functions of the GI tract, which corresponds to Chapter 64 in Guyton. The first part, we will do a basic overview of secretions, kind of basic mechanisms of stimulation of the glands. We'll also look at secretions from the oral cavity, the esophagus, and the stomach. Now, we're only going to do part of the stomach. We're going to talk about the secretions, but we're not going to be talking about the regulation of those secretions until the second part. Now, as a basic idea of the amount of secretions that we get in the GI tract, this picture kind of gives you an idea of it. We secrete a lot of fluid that's containing things like buffers and acids in some parts, hormones, enzymes. There's a large amount of secretions that take place throughout the GI tract. The overall functions of these secretions would be encompass things like protection, things like mucus that help protect the mucosal layer of the GI tract. It can serve as a digestive function. So when we look at certain enzymes or even bile, they aid in digestion or involved in digestion of the foodstuffs that we take in. They can also serve as a regulatory role. So hormones can regulate motility as well as secretions. So we have a large amount of secretions. They're each going to have slightly different functions, and that's what we're going to be covering. Now, basic mechanisms behind what stimulates secretions include the nervous system as well as the just direct contact with food. We have glands in the mucosa that if food is just coming by, if they just contacts it, they will release their secretions. But we also have the nervous system, the enteric nervous system, as well as the autonomic nervous system. So the enteric nervous system, remember, is the kind of local nervous system of the GI tract. We have a number of different reflexes that will be involved. So we have certain sensory receptors that sense things like changes in pH, contact, certain chemicals that are present in the food. So you have a lot of local factors that will work through the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system releases certain hormones, and that influences the secretions of different parts of the GI tract. Remember, we'd also talked about its role in regulation movement, but today we're talking mainly about secretions. But you also have, besides the enteric nervous system, you also have the role of the autonomic nervous system. Now, parasympathetic versus sympathetic. This picture you've seen before, but I've actually gone through and erased some of the things that were not involved in the GI tract. Overall, parasympathetic increases secretions. And remember, we discussed about the cranial division as well as the sacral division. So here's the sacral division, here's the cranial division up here. Well, in regards to control of secretions, you have things like the cranial nerves 7 and 9. They will innervate salivary glands, so that'll be involved in salivation. You have cranial nerve 10, which innervates the stomach and the duodenum and the esophagus. Those will influence secretions from those areas. The let's not do the sympathetics yet. The sacral division, the pelvic splanchnic nerves, they innervate glands that are found in the large intestine, and they in predominantly the latter part of the large intestine, and they will increase secretions from the glands that are found there. One thing to kind of, even though you can see some innervation in the latter parts of the small intestine, in regards to control of secretions, the main thing that controls secretions when you start in the jejunum, the ileum, and the first 2/3 of the large intestine is primarily controlled by the enteric nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is not as huge of a player in regards to secretions from those areas of the GI tract. Now, the sympathetics also innervate the GI tract. In overall, sympathetic stimulation is inhibitory. It will inhibit secretions. Small extent, if you have primarily just sympathetics alone, you can get some increases in secretion of local glands. But if you've got sympathetic stimulation, when you already have parasympathetic stimulation, you overall will have an inhibitory effect because it will constrict blood vessels that supply the glands, and so it's generally inhibitory. Hormones also play a role in regulating stimulation, and you kind of could see it in this earlier picture. So you just have some hormones that can be released. They go through the circulation and influence secretions. And I just gave you a couple examples, like cholecystokinin and secretin and gastrin. So you've heard of at least cholecystokinin and gastrin before. Gastrin is a hormone that's made both by the stomach as well as the intestine. Cholecystokinin, we had mentioned, is made by the intestine. Now, secretin is also made by the intestine. And when we look at control of secretions, we'll be discussing the role of cholecystokinin, secretin, and gastrin. Now, what's involved in overall getting the secretions out into the lumen of the GI tract, it's basically in regards to stimulation, either nervous system or hormonal or things like that. You will increase through its second messenger systems. You're going to have more production of the certain things that are involved, that are proteins. You're going to, on the ribosomes, you're going to increase the formation of these proteins. Going to be modified by going through the Golgi and the endoplasmic reticulum, and you'll eventually release by exocytosis into the lumen of the GI tract. Well, the organic substances will also be secreted along with water and electrolytes and even things like bicarbonate. So they're going to each have a certain purpose. Now, the organic substances, we're just being very general right now, but as we go through the different parts of the GI tract, we'll be discussing the various organic substances that are released. So we're going to, before we kind of start with the oral cavity, I want to talk about one particular secretion, because this secretion is found throughout the GI tract. No matter where we are, this is a secretion. So if I asked you on an exam, name a secretion from the esophagus, or the colon, or the oral cavity, anywhere, your answer could be mucus, because this is found everywhere. And there's a reason why. Now, mucus, the ultimate composition of mucus, or specific composition, will vary depending on where we are. But overall, it's a mixture of water, electrolytes, and mucin. Now, this picture kind of shows you that consistency that you get because of mucin. It's kind of a, not real thick, but it can be thick. Normal mucus should be able to move fairly easily, but it has a little bit of stickiness to it. Now, the characteristics of mucin and the mucus in general allows it to serve a number of different roles in the GI tract. It's a lubricant. It's a protectant. So it is amphoteric. Now, if you remember from biochemistry, amphoteric means that it can act as an acid or a base. So it's going to be kind of a buffer to some extent. It also allows for things to move through the GI tract a little bit easier, allows for easy slippage. Now, it is also relatively resistant to digestion, so if this is coating the mucosal lining throughout the GI tract, it does protect the mucosal lining from digestion itself, from if we are in certain parts of the GI tract that have digestive enzymes. And it also protects the mucosal lining from, we call it excoriation. Excoriation is just physical wear and tear or abrasion of the mucosal layer. This is not the same thing we talk about it's protecting against from acids or from digestive enzymes. Here we're talking about specifically things are moving across the mucosal lining. Just because of things moving across you from normal wear and tear, you can abrade the layer of the GI tract. So mucus helps prevent against that excoriation. Other components of secretions that we talk about will protect against digestion of the mucosa, as well as the protectant against things like acids that may be found in that particular part of the GI tract. So that mucus, we're going to see, is going to be found no matter where we are. Now we're going to look at the first secretion that we're going to get in the oral cavity, which does include mucus, and we're going to be looking at the salivary glands. So this is a picture that kind of depicts the parotid glands, but we're going to be looking at the salivary glands and their secretions. So we have the parotids. You've got the sublingual, underneath the tongue, and the submandibular glands. These are exocrine glands that will release their secretions into the oral cavity via ducts. And that's more of an anatomy thing, so you can review which duct releases each secretion into the oral cavity. But we have different types of cells found in these glands. You have mucus cells, you have serous cells. Now they're going to release their secretions, they're going to empty and leave through these ducts. Now the mucus cells are pretty self-explanatory what they're going to be making, but we're going to go over them again, and we're going to look at the secretions from the serous cells. Now if you look at the parotid gland is primarily a gland that is involved in secretions of a very serous fluid, and the parotid gland has the secretions from the serous cell. It is a little bit more watery than the secretions from the mucus cells. The mucus cells are a little bit thicker, more viscous. The submandibular and the sublingual glands, they have a mixture of serous fluid and mucus. So let's kind of look over what each of these cells secrete and their overall functions. And the mucus cells secrete mucus. Mucus is a little thicker, a little more viscous secretion. We looked at earlier overall kind of the characteristics of mucus, which allows it to act as a lubricant. So you'll see here one of the things it does is it helps to soften, moisten the food, helps to bind that food together until we make a bolus that we're going to be swallowing. The serous cells, their secretions are a little more watery. Primary secretion from the serous cells is an enzyme called alpha amylase. It's also referred to as thialin. We can also refer to this as salivary alpha amylase because we do have an amylase made by the pancreas also. But the salivary alpha amylase, that enzyme, the job of the enzyme is to start the digestion of starches in your food. So it begins the digestion of a polysaccharide, starch, and the smallest product you can get to is the disaccharide maltose. So it starts the digestion of starches. If you chew enough, long enough, you can digest the starches, but the smallest product that you'll get is maltose. So digestion is not complete, though, in the oral cavity because maltose will not be able to absorb maltose. But we'll start the digestion of starch. Now that enzyme, the amylase, works best at a pH of around like 6 or 7. So we have to make sure the pH of the contents in our oral cavity is around 6 or 7, otherwise that enzyme won't work very well. But the secretions that we get besides the mucus and starch is we do also release some other components that help to keep that pH about 6 or 7 to make the enzyme work a little bit better. Now if you notice here, we have, it says ECF, just components of the extracellular fluid. So we have your amylase, your mucus, and you have things like sodium and potassium and bicarb and chloride. Now that bicarb is going to help or aid in keeping the pH in the oral cavity at a decent pH for proper digestion of starch, but also will serve another role that we're going to talk about very shortly. Now that primary secretion, you're going to have water also, is going to be very close to what you see in your plasma. It's going to be isotonic. But as it moves through the ducts, here's the ducts, water stays pretty much there, but we're going to modify the content somewhat. You have a sodium-potassium pump that lines those ducts, and sodium will be reabsorbed, potassium will be secreted. You have some other transporters that allow chloride to be reabsorbed, but bicarb is secreted. By the time it makes its way through here, we're going to alter it somewhat if you have enough time for it to go to the ducts. If you have very quick, rapid secretions, that the saliva may, the composition may be slightly different, but overall what you get in the saliva is you're going to have a lot more, which is more important for me, is you have a little more bicarb than before, and what that bicarb's role will be. So we do have, one thing I also want to mention is I have a star by this, the sodium potassium pump. One, remember, it's an active transport, but this pump here is also regulated by aldosterone. So remember, we've talked about that before. Aldosterone can influence this pump. It influences the sodium potassium pump in the kidneys, in the GI tract, including the salivary glands, and so it can alter, especially if you're needing to reabsorb as much sodium as you possibly can. That's going to be important. But overall, when you have the secretions from the salivary glands, you're going to have your enzyme, your mucus, you're going to have some electrolytes, and you're going to have bicarb. So that bicarb, we said, is going to help to keep the pH in your oral cavity proper pH for digestion of the starch. But we're going to look at some other things. So let's kind of do an overview of the saliva, and I'm going to introduce you a couple other things that are also part of saliva. So we mentioned mucus. Mucus helps to lubricate the food, makes it easier to swallow. So with a mucus as well as water, helps to assist in swallowing. It will help to bind the food together into a bolus. The myelin helps to begin digestion of starches. Bicarbonate, it helps to buffer acids in the mouth. And so where were the acids? Well, you have bacteria in your mouth that are always producing acids. So the bicarb helps to buffer those acids, helps with when we do the proper pH for amylase, but also think about you're salivating now. You salivate all the time. That bicarbonate is needed to help protect your tooth enamel. So if you don't have proper secretion of saliva with that bicarb, your incidence of dental caries increases. The secretion of saliva is relatively low when you sleep. That's why some people they advocate those certain toothpastes that, they work while you sleep, because it's trying to protect your teeth from the bacteria. Another thing that helps to protect the oral cavity from bacterial populations is the secretions of IgA and lysozyme. That helps to control the bacterial population in your mouth also. Now, here's a problem, or could be a problem. If saliva serves a very important role in protecting the teeth, the oral cavity, from all this bacterial population, and also it also helps aid in swallowing process. I mean, it's not absolutely necessary, believe it or not, to have all that digestion of the starch in the mouth, because most of us do not chew our food long enough that you have significant digestion of starches. But if you don't salivate sufficiently, it's going to be very difficult for swallowing. And also the incidence of dental caries goes up significantly if you have issues with salivation. So a clinical correlation is something called Sjogren's syndrome. Now, Sjogren's syndrome is an autoimmune condition in which initially what it does is it destroys the glands that are in the oral cavity, the salivary glands, as well as lacrimal glands. So classic presentation is very dry eyes, very dry mouth. The tongue is just very dry. The whole oral cavity is dry. There's some other systemic manifestations of it, but the primary thing is problems with the glands involved in lubrication in the eye and the oral cavity. Now, this is a picture of Venus Williams. This tennis player, Venus Williams, was diagnosed with Sjogren's syndrome. Caused her to pull out of some tournaments because of the diagnosis until they can do some more treatment, and they generally just treat the symptoms. There is no cure for this condition. Now, the salivation itself is completely controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Okay, it's all completely from the autonomic nervous system. So you have sensory receptors in the mouth and in the pharynx that sense tactile stimuli, taste, sends sensory information to a salivatory nuclei found in the brainstem. So we have in the brainstem, we have superior and inferior salivatory nuclei found in the brainstem that's receiving input from the tongue, parts of the mouth, part in the pharynx. It interprets that information. And also another thing that can send information is higher brain centers, the thought of food, the smell of food, the sight of food. That's going to send information down to this center in the brainstem, which then sends motor input to the salivary glands through cranial nerves 7 and 9, and that will affect salivation. So if you see something, you smell something good, something you want, you're going to start to salivate. The presence of food in your mouth will start you to salivate. Now the thing is though, that if there is something in your mouth that is bad tasting, or you smell something that's not very appetizing, that actually will decrease salivation. You can also have reflexes that originate in the stomach and the upper intestine, that you have irritating substances down there that send information up to the brainstem, and it's going to start to increase salivation because it's kind of a preemptive strike. If you're going to start to vomit, you want to start to kind of protect that oral cavity from all that acid that's going to be coming up. If you've got a lot of stress, the sympathetics will stimulate some secretions, but it's going to be primarily very viscous. It's going to be, it's not going to be very watery. Overall, though, when you think about if you're stressed, your mouth becomes really dry, becomes very difficult to swallow. And very viscous solutions are kind of difficult to swallow. But overall, when you think about salivation, you think about something that smells good, tastes good, you're going to increase salivation. It makes it easier to swallow and digest it. One thing that you may be aware of is a thing called Pavlov's dog, where they train the dog that when they gave it the food, okay, it's like it knew that, oh, food's going to come, so it would salivate. But then when they would feed the dog, they'd ring a bell. And after so many period of time, if they just rang the bell, they didn't give the animal food, the dog would salivate. It could be a learned response, but it's still mediated from the autonomic nervous system. Now, once you have that salivation, you got mixed with food, you've chewed it up, it's going to move down to the esophagus. Now, the esophagus also has some secretions, and these secretions are primarily, it's mucus. Okay? So here's some glands, some esophageal glands. The mucus is primarily mucus, aids in the swallowing process, acts as a lubricant, makes it easier to swallow. It also protects from excoriation, so that physical wear and tear. So allows it to slide down easily and doesn't wear away that mucosal lining. It also, because it has some buffers in it, it helps to protect that gastroesophageal junction from acid. So right where the stomach and the esophagus meet, when the sphincter opens, you could have a little bit of gastric juice that moves back up in the esophagus, and you want to protect it from being damaged from acid. So primarily the esophageal secretions assist in swallowing, protects the mucosal layer from excoriation as well as stomach acid. Now, once we enter the stomach has a lot of different secretions. If you look at the picture of the stomach, we have glands that are called Oxyntic glands that are found in the body, in the fundic part of the stomach. You have the Pyloric glands that are found in the antral part of the stomach. Now, one we don't show you is we have surface mucus glands because they're everywhere. They're on the surface of the mucosa. The surface mucus glands, they secrete mucus, and its job is to coat the mucosal lining with about 1 millimeter thickness of mucus, which helps to protect the mucosal lining from damage. Now, we're going to be looking at the various secretions from these glands. I'm going to do the pyloric glands first. That is mucus. Again, mucus is everywhere. It also, the G cells in that region secrete the hormone gastrin. Gastrin we're going to be looking at as its role in the controlling of hydrochloric acid secretion. So we're not going to be discussing that one today, but we just want to introduce you to the secretions from the glands. Now, the Oxyntic glands have a lot of different cells that secrete various things. So we're going to start with the mucus neck cell. So here is a gastric gland. Along here, along the neck, you have these cells called mucus cells. The mucus cells secrete mucus. So, just like we said before, mucus is a lubricant. It also helps to protect this mucosal lining from digestion, because we'll be looking at an enzyme that can digest proteins, as well as protect it from acids that can erode the mucosal lining. The gastric glands, or it's also called the Oxyntic glands or gastric glands, also have these other cells. They have parietal cells as well as chief cells. Now, the chief cells secrete an inactive enzyme called pepsinogen. The pepsinogen must be converted to its active form pepsin in order for it to work. Now, pepsin is an enzyme that starts digesting proteins. So the proteins will be broken up into smaller components called peptides. Well, what activates pepsin? Because the chief cells secrete pepsinogen, which is not active. Well, to start it becoming active, you need hydrochloric acid that's secreted by parietal cells. Now, parietal cells will secrete, that's obviously a spelling, should be an E at the end, secrete hydrochloric acid, and we'll be looking at a little bit later, not today, where how you make hydrochloric acid, because the parietal cells don't store hydrochloric acid. It's secreted, the hydrogen ions and the chloride is secreted actually separately, and then you have your hydrochloric acid. Now, the hydrochloric acid helps to cleave some amino acids from pepsinogen, and when those amino acids are, or smaller parts, you see more of a peptide, is cleaved from pepsinogen, it assumes its proper three-dimensional shape. And when it assumes its proper three-dimensional shape, it's active and you have pepsin. Pepsin will digest proteins, and some pepsin will help to kind of keep this thing going. You got some pepsin that will activate more pepsinogen into pepsin, but you still have to start it off with some hydrochloric acid. So we have chief cells that secrete pepsinogen. The pepsinogen is converted to pepsin by hydrochloric acid. The hydrochloric acid is one of the secretions of the parietal cells. So the hydrochloric acid not only serves as a role in activating pepsinogen, but the hydrochloric acids also denature proteins. So to make it easier to digest proteins, you denature it. Start messing with the three-dimensional shape of the proteins, makes it easier for enzymes to digest it. It also serves an antimicrobial role, and that helps to kill any microbes that you've swallowed with your food. So, and also think about when you breathe, you have that mucus that's secreted along the PCCE in the respiratory tract that traps certain pathogens in larger particles, and then you have the cilia that beat up, and eventually you swallow it, and then you can destroy those pathogens and the irritants that could damage the lung tissue. So you have parietal cells that secrete hydrochloric acid that helps to activate pepsinogen, denatures proteins and makes it easier for pepsin to work, and it kills off microbes. Well, the parietal cells also have one more secretion. It's intrinsic factor. So this is something you probably would have discussed in biochemistry. So in the food that you take in, you have vitamin B12, cyanocobalamin. You have a binding protein for that binds to cyanocobalamin. Well, in the stomach, intrinsic factor is released, and actually what happens is you have to get rid of this protein, and hydrochloric acid does aid in that. Intrinsic factor will bind the B12 and then transport it, go along the GI tract. Now in the ileum, this is where you'll absorb it. So what intrinsic factor does for you is it's going to aid in the absorption of B12 in the ileum. Intrinsic factor is that one absolutely necessary secretion that we have from the stomach. So you absolutely have to have that in order for life, is intrinsic factor, because it aids in the digestion of B12. Now B12 is needed for red blood cell production. That's why if